stages of actually being American, not British colonists. And eventually caused the American Revolution, basically.
I don't know if this is going to work as far as what you guys want to take, but we'll see. So, in some sense, you could say that this helped lead to the American Revolution. All right, anything else?
It did increase the price of owning land a little bit because they would have had to pay for the soldiers, more soldiers to protect more land.
Yeah, I think in general you could just refer to it having an inflationary aspect, which makes sense in general. That's kind of a more subtle aspect to this.
It was important to the future of America because it made the country more closely resemble what it does today. It increased the size of our country, us making it approach the size that it is today. I can't believe we once owned all of Canada, plus all that other land we gained by this point, because can you imagine how big our country would be today if we still owned all of Canada? We'd be the biggest country in the world.
Yeah. In terms of, again, depending on the perspective you're looking at this from, if we're looking at this as being from Britain's perspective, by the time the French and Indian War was over with, this was a huge, I mean, they were already a big empire, but this was a much larger empire. And that was kind of the piece I saw was missing up there because, again, when I say what are the consequences, what could be one of your first questions in terms of clarifying that question?
Consequences for which?
For whom,
British
right?
versus
Who are we talking about? And it's not just the British and the colonists. Who else is involved in this?
The French, the Indians.
The French, the Indians. So when you ask that question, you could really answer it from many different perspectives. What were the consequences for the Indians? What were the consequences for the colonists? What were the consequences for Great Britain as a whole? What were the consequences for the French? There's also a whole other piece of all the other European countries that, because the war here, the French and Indian War, is part of a bigger war going on in Europe, which is referred to as the 7 Years' War. So there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in Europe that ties to this, and we tend to get so isolated in our thinking here as Americans. We only think about how it affects us, and we don't think about maybe the consequences that are going on in other places. This is, again, this probably isn't going to show up the way that I want it to, but this map shows you kind of, just using colors basically, what things looked like just as the war was breaking out in 1754. And I don't know if you can tell the colors here, but basically the British only had the area in green. The French had all of this area down through the middle of the country and then obviously up into Canada. The Spanish are mostly out west. You even got the Russians up in, like what we think of as Alaska. So you've got, that's kind of the picture of things. So Britain's empire was mostly not here, but back over in Europe. But then after this war is over with, this is what things look like. And where are the French on the map to your right?
I don't know, I would think maybe, can you scoot over and look at it so I can see the right color? Then I can tell you.
You see any,
the other way.
You see any purple?
Oh yeah, well the French must have been in a little bit that purple area, but then their properties were greatly reduced.
See, if I do this, you might be able to
yeah,
tell.
the right picture, they're mostly up near the west border of Alaska and a little bit down, and then they got a little bit of in the Caribbean.
The Caribbean is where they mostly have some colonies left. But for the most part, they're gone, right?
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the total territory, obviously they're gone. Now that doesn't, it looks bad on the map because it looks like they lost control of this huge amount of territory. But when there weren't that many of them here to begin with, how much control did they really have? was not gonna be long before somebody was gonna kick them out because
And
they
there's still
wanted
lots of-
nothing to hold it.
There's still lots of French there though, right? They just didn't have any political power, they didn't have any.
Right,
or they
it's
just-
not like all the French got, put on ships and taken back to France. I mean, they're still in Canada, obviously, they just weren't in control of the government any longer. So there's a lot of different consequences to the French and Indian War, and it does really have, I mean, how many of you before taking, I know you studied the French and Indian War at some point in your history, because you have to as you come up through school, but how many of you remember it? I mean, most of us do remember something about the American Revolution, right?
Yeah.
But most people don't even know that there was this thing that took place. And they surely don't have any concept of the relationship of it to the American Revolution. And the fact that, as you said, there really is a tremendous connection. Because this war, besides the conflict with the Indians, the conflict with the French, all the other things that went on that had to do with the rest of the world, the conflict that resulted from Britain, the country, and the American colonists led to our American Revolution.
This also kind of all started the entire Indian removal and pushing them westward, right?
Yeah, well,
Because when they started using the germ warfare stuff with the
Right.
smallpox blankets and all.
and that's, I'm kind of getting ahead of this, aren't I? Stole your thunder, didn't I? Well, let me jump to their
All
question.
because I didn't take your paper.
See what you guys might have to add to
She's
that.
spiteful,
because
she'll
we
remember for a
kinda-
long time.
Anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, we think that if Britain would have developed more of a united front with the colonies, then they probably would have had more power and control. But because there was such conflict between them and there was such resentment between the British and the colonies, it just kind of opened up the door for like Spain and France to kind of come in and say, wait a minute, you really don't have much control here anyway. You give us this, we'll give you this, kind of trade off and make more of a, at the end it was more of a peaceful trade, but it took forever and a day for them to get there. So.
Well, just in terms of the basics that we've already covered, I mean, obviously France pretty much gets booted out of here in terms of control over territory. But who becomes our ally during the American Revolution? France. I mean, the seeds, the distrust and the wedge that's sown between Britain and the colonists opened that door for the French to kind of befriend the Americans. Now, do you think the French were doing that just because they thought the colonists were so wonderful?
No. They wanted their land.
I mean, they're thinking if they can, if they get over here, they help us fight this, they might end up walking away with something for themselves. I mean, they're not just doing it because, they're really nice people. So, it didn't quite work that way even in the Revolution. And we'll talk more about that, next week in terms of how we kind of stabbed them in the back after they helped us win that war. But that's a whole other story.
It's the American way.
And what you were saying that when I realized we already sort of dovetailed into their territory, is this, what's this red line on this map?
It is called, the thing is called the Proclamation Line. It was originally laid out by England, the authorities in England, so that English colonists wouldn't move past that line because they hoped the rest of the lands past it would go to the Indians.
And if they did that, if they kept that line there and they said that the colonists had to stay to the east and the Indians to the west, what would that prevent? You had said it before.
What's that, the removal of the Indians or?
Well, by doing this and saying, okay, because what's that line along? What's
Appalachian.
Appalachian Mountains, right?
Yeah, it's along the west side of the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, so if you put the Indians on the west and the colonists on the east, and everybody has their own space, then everybody should be happy, right?
Yeah.
There shouldn't be any conflict, and if there's no conflict, you don't have to have soldiers, and if you don't have to have soldiers, then you save money. So all of this, starts to tie together. So it seemed to make sense, right? Just push the Indians farther over. You're not being mean to them. You're giving them their own space, right? They've got their own land. You've got your land. Of course, maybe they wanted your land, but you said they could have this land instead, but that's a whole other story. So you move them over there, and that should be fine. But like Sean said, we're going to talk throughout the semester that we just keep doing this to the Indians, right? And eventually,
You can't push no more.
where are you going to put them, right? No place else to go. So, I mean, it's not quite like that, but still, we kept pushing them farther and farther west, and every time we did it, we promised them that this was their land forever.
Until we wanted it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to look up forever in the dictionary, right? Because obviously their interpretation of the word forever and ours is very different, but it was supposed to be forever. But it was, forever really meant until we needed it or wanted it for ourselves, right? So,
Now, do they have any concept of how big the New World was? Like, what was mapping and stuff like? Do they have any idea when they drew that line that there was that much, like, just, I mean, that they'd only really taken a small percentage of the entire continent?
yes and no.
That seems like I mean, I know the mountains were there and it was a good natural
Right.
barrier, but it seems kind of un-British to just take that little bit and be happy with it and give everything else to somebody else.
Are you saying agree?
You know?
It's very unfinished.
Well, I don't think that, what they knew about that land, I don't know that they fully knew how many miles of land there were between the Mississippi, because they pretty much had an idea of everything east of the Mississippi, even though they didn't have too many people living in it yet. They had explored that because they'd gone up and down the Mississippi. I don't know that anybody had too good of a sense of what was out in here, or maybe even out to here. They did have some sense of this area because of the Spanish having settled along the coast and then down in here. But, I mean, you're right, and that's why when, I started to say Roosevelt, it's when Jefferson became president and we got to the point of the Louisiana Purchase, which is marked on there, but we didn't have that yet at that time. He sent explorers out into that area because we didn't really have a sense of what was there. Is it livable? There was a sense in which that land wasn't actually livable. So what's the point? Even if it's this huge piece of land, if you can't live there, if you can't survive there, then it doesn't really matter if you control it or not.
So give it to the Indians.
Exactly. I mean, when we read Jackson's address to Congress in reference to Indian removal, his language actually is something to the effect of, this land is, I'm going to forget the exact wording, but favorable for the Indians. Like, white people couldn't live there, but Indians can, because of course they just eat dirt, right? So it doesn't matter. I mean, they definitely had a sense in which Indians are different than us, and they don't need as much as we need. They can get by on pretty much anything, so we'll just push them out there. That was like in the Oklahoma area. So exactly how much they understood about that land, I mean, it was definitely not fully knowing how much was there, and what was there, was it really, could you live there? I think there was a pretty good sense for a long time that most of that land out west of the Mississippi, you really couldn't live in. That changed after the Lewis and Clark expedition, when they explored the area. I mean, they still came back and said, you wouldn't want to live in some of this, but there are definitely places that are habitable.
You still wouldn't want to live in some of it.
No.
Have you been to Oklahoma?
I have not, I don't think. It's awful. I was talking to somebody the other day,
A
and
lot of reservations there too.
they told me that their brother lived in Idaho. And I was like, nobody lives in Idaho.
There's like 7 people there.
Yeah, exactly. One of the 7 lives out there.
And potatoes. That's all that's about.
Which I'm sure is completely untrue, but that's what it seems like to us, but Idaho, really? All right, so question 3. Anything else from anybody on question 1 or 2? Questions, concerns? Just one other point in reference to questions 1 and 2 together. The French and Indian War, I mean, France and England were at war with each other a lot, and, I mean, over the centuries. This war is another one of those wars that, like I said, has its parallel back in Europe at the time. So the fact that the French get kicked out of here in 1763 really does lead to a lot of animosity and tension between England and France, and that's going to characterize a lot of the stuff that we deal with in America with our first presidents, because Washington was dealing with the issues that really started with the 2 of them all the way up through Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, definitely the first 4 presidents, and then kind of into Monroe's presidency. So what happened here to the French, and then the fact that we didn't treat them very nicely after the American Revolution, those issues are going to lead to a lot of issues for us, because we're a very small country at that time. We don't really have any power. We have no real armed force, and we're trying to make our way in a world where both England and France aren't happy with us. It's really kind of amazing that we even survived as a country, because either one of them could have come in if they really chose to, and if they had been willing. They went flying all the way back to the back of the room. If they had really chosen to commit the resources, either one of them could have come in and just stomped us. And they didn't, because they had other issues on their plate.
Yeah, you mean the French and the Indians is one of them?
The French and the British.
Oh.
After the Revolution, years down the road, if they had chosen to commit the resources, I don't know if the Indians could have done that because they didn't have the weaponry. I mean, they did to a point because they were buying it from the English and the French, but not to the same degree that we had. And they didn't have the organization. We have this idea that all Indians got along, right? They had so much intertribal warfare that they kept themselves busy, and they couldn't ever unify really against the white man. So that's a whole other story. Same thing with, slaves. There were a whole lot more slaves in some areas of our country than there were white people. Why didn't they just rise up and kill all the white people? Well, kind of hard to do when there's 25 on this plantation and 2 over here and 15 over there, and none of them really talk to each other. Just because there's a lot of them doesn't mean that they're able to communicate and organize and then rise up to be able to attack the structure. So anyway, question number 3. What new policies affecting the colonies did Parliament adopt following the French and Indian War, and why did it adopt those policies?
The 3 biggest ones we narrowed it down to. The first one was the Sugar Act. The main reason for that was to eliminate illegal sugar trade between the colonies and the French and Spanish West Indies. I'm assuming the only reason they want to do that is to narrow it down so they'd have to trade with the British just for profit, A side thing that is British actually established a vice admiral court in America to accuse smugglers. So it's the first time they put in there just to actually enforce these things. Second one was the Currency Act of 1764. It was the idea to retire all paper money and stop the colonies from printing their own money. But it didn't really exactly say why that was. We have reason to believe it was just so they could establish their own economy without necessarily needing the British.
Well, that may be a piece of it, but the thing is that the fact that, the colonists didn't have hardly any actual money, hard money. Most of the money they would have had would have been British sterling, and they didn't have that much of it.
Right.
So they paid for things with the currency that they created themselves. Well, that worked okay within the colonies, because they kind of come up with a medium of exchange. They had an understanding of what everything was worth. But when they wanted to use that same currency to pay for products from England, England didn't want to take their paper currency. It wasn't worth anything to them back in England. They wanted sterling. So they thought by retiring all the currency and forcing people to have to deal in British sterling, that they would end up with more money.
Right. Yeah.
But if you know anything about, remember I told you that I took a money and banking class that was much more interesting than economics? Well, anytime you reduce the money supply and you make it so much more difficult to get a hold of money, which I know is hard for us to understand because, we could just go print it, right? Well, you need more money, just go print it, pass it out to people, right? Doesn't
Isn't
quite
that
work
considered
that way.
counterfeiting?
What?
Isn't that considered counterfeiting?
No, I'm talking about the U.S. government doing it. If they needed more money in circulation, why not just go print more? But the less money in circulation leads to certain economic problems. The more money in circulation leads to other kinds of problems economically. So it's not so simple as just saying, oh, well, we want more British sterling to be floating around, so we'll just get rid of all currency. This led to some real difficulties for the colonists because how are they supposed to purchase things if they don't actually have any British sterling? They work work in many ways off of kind of a barter system. Well, they can't do that if they have to pay for everything in sterling. This caused serious economic problems in the colonies. I feel that this is a much more serious issue than all of the taxes that Britain tried to impose upon them. Because most of the taxes, as I said last week, were pretty minimal. They didn't actually have as much of an economic impact. It was just more frustrating to the colonies
Right.
because they didn't have any say. But this had serious implications for the
It was more of a sense of control, you know?
Right, 'cause what do you do?
Right. They were
What do
forced
You
to,
could be rich in a colony, but
Right,
be broke because you can't pay for what.
right. So how do you even purchase anything or do any kind of business with the British if you don't have that actual hard, cold cash, as they called it, to be able to do business? Okay, what other things did they,
the big one was the Stamp Act of 1765, imposing a tax on most printed documents.
again, not a huge tax,
Right,
but pervasive.
right.
You pretty much can't avoid this one, because whether you're buying a liquor license or having to get some kind of legal document drawn up or just buying a newspaper at the local tavern, you're gonna have to pay this tax. So this was, you know, again, it's not a huge tax, but the fact that it pretty much affected everybody was very aggravating to the colonies.
Right. And that was more for like money, you know, revenue. And also it says in the book to reapply the colonies the old principles of mercantilism, so.
Yeah, they're trying to impose that we're in control after
Right.
years of not really enforcing this, and as we've already said, it doesn't work very well. Anything else?
That was the three biggest ones we could find.
Okay, another one that doesn't usually get talked about is the Quebec Act, which is not so much a tax or anything like that, but it's some of the things that they're doing here that lead them to believe, it's like, it's establishing a precedent that the colonists get nervous about. A couple things that happened here with the Quebec Act. Remember, when Britain won the French and Indian War, they take over most of what was settled in Canada at the time. There's still a lot of land in Canada that nobody lives there except, you know, natives, and no European power has taken it over yet. But the purple areas are the areas that Britain decides to, I mean, if you look at this map, I mean, this part of the map is now, today, part of the United States of America, right? But they decided that this whole area in purple would be the colony of Quebec. Problem with that is the British colonies that had been established over here, when they established their colonies, their charters read that their land went from sea to sea. Now, how do you interpret that?
Like body of water to body of water?
Yeah, so which body of water are we talking about?
Well,
Like
Yeah.
Atlantic Ocean.
The Atlantic to start with, right? But where does it
would be
stop?
on the other side. But if,
What other side?
well, the other side of the United States, but the continent. But if, it depends on whatever the king meant. If the king was calling one of the Great Lakes a sea, kind of like Little Sea, maybe he meant that.
Yeah, but if you're talking about colonies that are in this area, then basically, the only sea that they really knew about was the Mississippi. I mean, they knew that the Pacific was way over there, but they didn't have control of that. The Spanish were over there.
But,
So they at least thought their charter went to the Mississippi. Right? So you've got, I'm getting my
so
own
how
geography
can they
mixed
call
up.
the Mississippi a sea? It's a river, not a sea.
Because remember, when they settled this in the 1600s, they didn't really know what they were dealing with.
Oh,
But what they came to understand it as was at least the Mississippi. Now, in their minds, when they said sea to sea, remember, they didn't know how big the continent was, and they probably didn't realize that the other real sea was the Pacific, which was way over there.
yeah.
But as time went on, as we got into the 1700s, the colonies began to think of their charters as going from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Now, all of a sudden, Britain comes in and says, this colony is now Quebec, and all of this land in here that you thought you owned, whichever of these colonies are, this is no longer yours.
Yeah.
We're going to give it to this other colony called Quebec. and that colony will be Catholic, because the British, remember, don't like Catholics, but mostly the French were Catholic, and so most of these people living in Quebec are French, so they conceded to them that they could continue to practice their faith, which was Catholic. And they were not allowed to have a representative assembly, whereas most of our American colonies had created their own representative assemblies. Now, they still didn't have representation back in Parliament, but they had their own local representation. And Britain says, in this colony of Quebec, you're not going to have that. Well, that didn't bother the French that much because they didn't have that before. But the British colonies had gotten used to having a representative assembly. So now all of a sudden in 1774, you pass this law, you create this whole new colony that you're giving our land to, you allow them to be Catholic, which most of the British don't like the Catholics, and you're not allowing them a representative assembly. So you can imagine that some American colonists are going to be like, wait a minute, this is not the way we do things here.
So England said, chartered that, England said that the colony of Quebec would be allowed to be Catholic, right?
And most of the British, you know, the American colonists, Catholicism is not really accepted.
And also make July taxes there or something like that?
I don't know at this point exactly what the tax structure would have been in Quebec, if it's going to be any different than the other places. That could have been another issue, I'm not sure about that. But there's some things being passed here in 1774 that seem to be establishing a precedent that if the colonists don't object, then maybe Britain's going to start trying to do some of this in the other colonies. So again, it's another one of those acts that I think is more significant than we realize. We always hear about the taxes. But there's other things going on. It's not just the fact that they're trying to tax them. It's the control that they're starting to try to have over them that they didn't for a long, long time. So it isn't just one thing. It isn't just the fact that there's some taxes being put into place. It's all of the different measures in a relatively short period of time between 1763, as the war ended. Because, I mean, even the first thing, if you want to go back up here, the very proclamation of 1763. If you're a colonist and have just been fighting this war since 1754, and you've won, don't you feel that you have the right now to move into that territory that you've just conquered? I mean, the French were the ones who had control of the territory down through the middle of the country.
Yeah.
And the Indians, but, you know, we don't care about the Indians, remember? So the French are gone now, so why can't we move over there? We just fought this war. We have sacrificed.
Oh,
We've been willing to die for this. Why can't we move into this territory?
So England said wanted them to reserve that for the Indians?
Yep, all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So you've got that already. And then you've got these different acts that take place over the next 10 years, pretty much. And so, of course, people are going to start to say, wait a minute. Life was very different just 10 years ago. How much control do you really think that you could have over us? And you could even make those parallels today. Whether you agree with what some of the things Obama's trying to do today, you could at least understand maybe why people would question some of the changes. And not just what this change is doing right now, but what's happening down the road. Is this a precedent for the way we're going to do things in 5 years, 10 years, that maybe this isn't so bad, but if it continues in this way, are we going to wish that we had rethought this whole thing? And again, I'm not, you know, don't get me wrong, because I haven't told you my position on any of these issues. I'm just saying I can understand the perspective of why people might be concerned about some of the changes that we see taking place. I'm not trying to push any political agenda here by any means. Anything else? So, answering the last part of that question, what's the main reason that Britain adopted these policies that you think, based on what you've read?
Probably the biggest ones would be revenue, to regain that, and then of time, and actually when they established, I remember reading the book, when they established it, the revenues from America did increased it a lot, but that, it's not that the Americans weren't, or the colonists weren't paying this money, it's just they were really upset about it, So I mean, it did work, it just backfired many years later.
And we all know that there's times where people do things just for the sake of having control and having
Right.
power, and there really is no other reason. They just have to be in power. And there could have been some of that here, I don't know. But I do think that a lot of this is motivated by the fact that Britain is in serious debt at this time. Now, again, another perspective. Are we in debt in our country today?
Yeah, mostly because.
A little bit?
We've just been going slow, most of us, we've been slowly going downhill ever since I was born. Like ever since I was a baby.
Well, and that's what a lot of people believe, right? And so, and we're in serious debt, right? Now, how many of you can honestly say, and if you can, it's okay, can honestly say that you have laid in bed at night and lost sleep over the fact that we are $16 or more trillion in debt?
I think that.
Do you? Okay. Do most of you?
I totally do.
And aren't we trying to make it like start another war with February?
Serious.
Syria.
See, I think about it, but I can't say that I've laid in bed and worried about it.
I don't know.
Like it's kept me awake at night.
No, I think about it, but I don't.
I've been debates about the women on it.
Now, the reason why I asked that question is because
Good line.
we live in a society today where being in debt is not considered necessarily, I don't mean $16 trillion in debt, but being in debt as a country is not considered a horrible thing. It's it depends on how much you're in debt, I think, but we don't think of being in debt as being a really bad thing. Economically, it can actually be a good thing in some ways. But in this time period, being in debt was considered, it was just unacceptable. They really felt that if they were in debt, that their country would just collapse, that they would not be able to be successful. We don't necessarily think that way today. So we accept at least a certain amount of debt. I mean, I think we all realize we're too far down that road now.
Well, our whole country's been kind of based on debt. If you don't have some sort of debt, you don't have credit, and you can't do anything.
Right. So even on a personal level, it's considered like,
Yeah.
of course everybody has some debt. And we used to throw people in jail for, not paying their bills, which is really stupid.
There's
if
been
you
a lot of
think
people
about
in jail.
it. Exactly. I mean, if you defaulted on a loan, you went to jail. Which, again, it really doesn't make sense, because how do you pay back a loan if you're in jail, right? I mean, wouldn't it be better to put them to work in some way and force them to pay it off? But still, we have a very different attitude toward debt today. So we don't get so freaked out over our country being in debt, or at least we didn't until it got really out of hand, which has only really been in the last decade that it's gotten to this point. Like I said, I think I said this in class a couple weeks ago, under Clinton, we had a balanced budget. And again, I'm not saying that because Clinton was such a wonderful president. It doesn't, in many ways, it has no relationship to the president. It has a relationship to the circumstances. And we went into debt because we went into Iraq. Well, of course, it cost money to fight a war. Now, you can argue, should we have gone or not? That's a whole other question, but we did, and that's going to lead to debt. And it has every time we've ever been in war. I mean, one of our greatest debts in this country was during World War II. But in some ways, that debt got us out of the Great Depression because it put us back to full employment.
But it fools people too, because war stimulates the economy at a certain level. So people see war. Like, I work for a company that half of our business is defense. And so it's like, but I work on the commercial side, so it's like when there's war, half our company is way up. When there's not, and the rest of the economy is okay, the other half's way up. So it's like,
That's probably a good balance for a company.
it's
So
not bad.
kind of like being invested in both stocks and bonds. Usually when one's up, the other's down, vice versa. Diversified company, right? All right, so you all had to answer this question on your discussion board, so maybe it's kind of unfair for Matt and Albert and Amber to get this question in class, but do you think Great Britain had the right to tax the American colonies?
We said yes, because at the time they were going through that whole debt thing,
of a sudden you have to impose something that is different from what they've been used to for the past 100 or so years.
And it sounded like most of you on the discussion board kind of took that same approach, that it's one thing, for a country to have the right to tax its people. And, like I've said in this class before, the American colonists, no matter how far away they are from England, they're still English citizens. And England does have a right to expect a certain amount of revenue from them. However, and Rachel made a good point in the discussion board, I think it's important that the people themselves know what their taxes are for, and that, it's a fair amount that they're having to pay, and that they have some understanding of what their money is going toward. And not that Britain maybe didn't do that, but the coming in with the big stick immediately after a war where the colonists felt like they had actually contributed. Of course, Britain maybe didn't agree with that interpretation, but the colonists felt like they had contributed and made a sacrifice and everything else, and then to come in and just start saying, you didn't help like you should have, and we need to keep you in line now to make sure you don't cause us any more problems and cost us more money, so you have to stay on this side of the Appalachians, and you're going to have to start paying these taxes. Even if it wasn't a lot of money, it just doesn't look as if the way they went about it was going to win them any friends. And I think the other piece, and Sean brought this out in what he said before, a piece of this that was not present before the French and Indian War, and this is important for understanding what happens here, because we have this tendency to think of the 13 colonies as being like all best buddies, and they all got together for reunions every year, and they really pretty much hated each other. The 13 colonies did not get along with each other. There was very serious regional differences. They really thought that the way another colony did things was just not the way you should do things. And they didn't like to do business with each other than what they had to. And so,
Some had different religious beliefs too.
yeah, that's another good piece, because different regions, you've got your Puritans up in New England, you got your Quakers who nobody could understand, the Catholics, of course, nobody ever liked them anyway, and then the Church of England, all of these different groups that they didn't see eye to eye at all. So when Ben Franklin tried to get them to come together in 1754 with what was called the Albany Plan, he came up with a way that they could work together in cooperation to try to deal with the situation with the French and the Indians, and they were like, nah, we're fine. We don't want to join with those other colonies. We just don't really like them. So he was trying to come up with something that they could do so Britain wouldn't impose something on them, and they weren't interested. But the French and Indian War kind of, sometimes even when you don't like somebody, you ally with them if you have a common enemy, right? So this wedge that was imposed between Britain and the colonies kind of led them to start to unify with each other. And that wasn't in place before. So now the people here that really do think that independence is an option and something that they would like, now they've got something to work with. Because we all have something about Great Britain we don't like now. And we can play with that. We can use that to our advantage. So what you start seeing in the 1770s is a tremendous amount of, and there's no other way to put it, but propaganda. That the colonists that wanted independence really began to use to stir people up against Great Britain. And remember, I said before that even once we declared independence, only about 40% of the American colonists were really in favor of that. 20% were completely opposed. And then they believe another 40% were just kind of like, not really sure what we should do. But they, on their own, would not have opted for that. They hadn't been pushed to that point yet. So it's not, like all American colonists are ready to fight Great Britain, which is another reason why we had so much trouble in the American Revolution, because people were like, hey, I can make money off of this. I'll sell stuff to the British. I'll sell my food, my crops to them. They'll pay more money. They'll pay with British sterling, not this continental currency that is worthless.
Yeah.
How would you feel? you're a colonist fighting for independence, and you find out that your neighbor is selling his crops to feed the British soldiers, not your own soldiers. That's the kind of stuff that, you know, was happening in the American Revolution. That's why it amazes me we won. We really shouldn't have won this war. And I think I said that in my discussion board, that, you know, we could all have had that really cute, you know, accent that they have. Instead, to talk like this.
And then the way they fought, line up and shoot each other, like, come on now.
Yeah, they hadn't quite figured that one out either. All right, so in the last few minutes, let's talk about this. Was it avoidable?
No.
Not really. I think the Americans really kind of had to be free.
That, you know, the question,
Had to be independent.
maybe the question is timing, right? Maybe it wouldn't have had to happen that 1776.
Could have been indefinitely postponed.
That might
I
be.
think the British government used too much taxes and too much control, is what it made them set it off.
I think really what happened was they didn't really establish enough boundaries when they allowed so many people to leave. And it was like, I'll give you this if you go over there, and they didn't really establish too many boundaries. So then there were like all these colonies that had their own religious beliefs, their own little community, and they were unified. And then by the time Britain finally like woke up and said, oh, wait a minute, this is our net worth over there, and they started it was like too little too late. Like you didn't establish from the get-go boundaries. You can't just start imposing rules years after the fact. I mean, it's like raising a child.
Exactly. So again, if you remember, 1607 is the first American colony, the first British colony. 1776 is when they declare independence. That's how long? 69 years? That's a long time to really not have a lot of control and then to try to impose it.
I don't think Britain thought that far ahead.
No.
I really think that that's how it started, because when they let them establish colonies over here, I don't think they thought that it was going to be profitable over here. I thought they just thought of us over here as a resource. That's it.
I think they thought
We'll
that
put some colonists over there so they can do what they need to do as far as goods and resources and stuff, and they can ship that to us, and, you know.
Okay. And
That's
they'll
it.
die off
They'll die, exactly.
before they
They'll
even
be
build
gone soon
something.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which they almost did.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about all the struggles they had in the
You
first.
also had multiple generations now that had never really lived under English rule. It wasn't the people that originally came over here that were used to a little bit of it. It was 6 generations down that had never even seen.
They were like, Britain
any
knew.
of that. They had no idea how Parliament worked. They didn't know what any of this stuff was, you know?
And it's harder to bring this out in this class because it's, you know, definitely very much of a survey class, but you do by this point start to see, even though they still were proud to be English and that kind of thing, there was still a sense of them developing their own independent culture, you know, their own kind of personality, you know, as a group. And even though they may not have liked each other, it's kind of like even here. I mean, I joke about, you know, Texas and that we don't really claim them and those kinds of things. You know, our different states have their own personalities, but if anybody else attacked one of those states, we'd all be there to rally around them. So we have our own kind of internal prejudices and things like that, but yet we know we're the United States of America. Well, they were starting to kind of develop some of that, especially through this French and Indian War. And I don't even know if they realized it. I don't even know if the American colonists really understood that even though they might still have called themselves English, that they really were developing into something different than that, and that they weren't really anything like people who lived in England anymore. But they may not really have understood that because they probably have never been to England. And, you know, kind of figuring out that they have their own identity is what's happening in this period leading up to the American Revolution.
What did the people in England actually think of the colonists? Like when they sent soldiers over there to fight this war, like what were there bonds between them, or was there a group of the colonists who fought with them, and then there was the group of the British who fought for the same side, but did they even treat them with as much respect?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I don't know that I can answer it from a complete. It's not like I've done research on
Right,
the issue,
yeah.
but I do think, from what I have read and studied, that most of the British back in England saw the colonists as beneath them.
Right, yes, that's what I figured.
Yeah. They just did not have the same respect for them. They didn't think they were as intelligent, they didn't think they worked as hard, they were seen as like, you know, like poor white trash.
Right, yeah.
And so that doesn't help, because there's always that sense of arrogance on the part of the British, and the Americans feel that prejudice toward them. And then, when they did come over here, because, again, you know, the English side of the Americans is not being willing to fight, not doing things to really help the war effort, but part of that might have just been that the colonists didn't fight the same way they did. You know, they weren't willing to go out there in a bright red coat where everybody could see them and stand in an open field and, you know, face the enemy. And
There's
just
one
pick
point
a
they
shot.
mentioned in the book that it's, that the British soldiers looked at them as like unorganized and kind of not like uncouth and just not,
Now, keep in mind that the American militia wasn't like the British Army. I mean, in the British Army, there were standards of discipline. They were very strict. You would get punished. But the American militia was a volunteer group. I mean, they didn't really, and they chose their own leaders. And you often chose a leader that wasn't going to be too hard on you. So if somebody tried to impose too much discipline, you just got rid of him and, you know, chose somebody else. So you can kind of see from the British perspective, yeah, these Americans were not a trained army by any means, and they did seem undisciplined. But they're doing it as volunteers. They're not getting paid to go fight in the French and Indian War like the British soldiers are. So, you know, what do you expect from people that are volunteering and, you know, taking the risk of losing their life, and yet really aren't even getting paid anything by their own government? I mean, you can't expect too much from them. But I do think that it's important for us at this age in our lives, as opposed to when you're in second grade or, you know, even 8th grade, to see that there's a different perspective to this. The British see the Americans very differently than the way this is often presented to us when we're kids. And they do have their, I think, justifiable grievances against the Americans for not being willing to help more with the war, not being willing to pay taxes, those kinds of things. And we kind of always presented it to our students as if the British were just so mean and horrible and demanded so much, and, you know, like every single American, you know, like little kids marched up and down the street saying, no taxation without representation, you know, like, and everybody was into this, and it's not like that. And by the time you're this age, I think it's okay to present both sides and to realize that they both had positions that could be argued and understood, you know, by an intelligent, reasonable person. But as Rachel said, and I think you said, I think it was inevitable that this was going to happen. Whether or not it could have been postponed if Britain had handled things better is the question. Because I really think Britain's arrogance caused them to not be willing to sit down and say, okay guys, we know this is the way it's been, but we really got to make changes. This is our situation, you know, what can we do here to,
Yeah,
to
there
come
was
up
no
with something?
discussion. There was just like,
Now, there was a point, I don't know if you caught this in the book, there was a point where they did come to the Americans and said, okay, you don't like our taxing, so can you come up with something? You know, how about if you come up with a plan and come up with something where you can say, we can give you X number of dollars and this is how we're going to do it. And the Americans just kind of went, okay, thanks for letting us, you know, think about that, but we're just not interested. So, you know, Britain's not getting any cooperation either, so you could see where they would just finally say, okay, fine, you're not going to help us out, we're just going to do it our way. And of course, they didn't think the Americans had any ability to declare independence and actually be successful. That's the arrogance piece of it too. And when we talk about the actual revolution, I mean, that's what tripped them up. The fact that they just did not take the Americans seriously at all. And even then, they probably still should have won. But then when the French got involved, that was kind of the icing on the cake. Without the French, I don't know that we would have done it.
most of these taxes that they were implementing, it's not like they was going back into the colonist community, right? It's not like now where you pay your taxes and it's gonna go fix roads and go to schools or, you know, ideally.
These new taxes, yes, they were going to go back to England to help.
So, yeah, so they were just all this, that's probably the big thing is this money that they'd probably be willing to pay taxes if it was going into in the running where they live, but it was all getting funneled over
Right.
overseas, so.
But again, you know, You're right, and that's probably one of the biggest issues the commons had, but again, the actual amount of the taxes was still pretty small. And even money we pay, like federal income taxes that we pay, don't all stay in our community. I mean, they go for the country as a whole. So they weren't willing to really let any of their taxes do that. And, you know, that's where I think there could have been some give and take on both sides. Anyway, oh, the thing I gave you guys is a matching quiz, basically. How many items are there? 20. And it's cryptic. It's very cryptic on purpose. But everything only has one answer. So even though it may seem like you could use something for a couple of them, then it comes down to, well, what's the best match? Because if you do that on a couple of them, then something else won't fit anything, right? I often use this as a quiz at about this time in the semester. I wasn't going to do that, but not for a grade. But first I thought, well, if you had time left, that we would just stay in your groups and see how many of them you can do. But we don't have that much time, so.
So do you even want to mess with this? Do you need to take it home?
Well,
or-
I'm going to let you take it home, and if it's up to you. You don't have to do it, but if it is one of those things that you're just like, oh man, this is a challenge, now I got to look at it and see if I can figure it out, then do it. If you don't want to, that's fine too. If you can do that, you'll probably be in a pretty good shape for the next quiz, because if you know all of that, then you probably know the two chapters pretty well. So we're just finished chapter 4, which means you have another quiz on chapters 3 and 4, which will be due by next Tuesday.
Okay, well,
That opens
we don't
up
need to
on
do this
Thursday.
one.
That, I just handed that out so you would have it in front of you for tonight.